When Jews aren't getting attacked around the world because of Israel's policies. When for our religion, we're not lumped in with the government. When parents don't fear sending their Jewish kids to school. The fear and the worry right now. And it's real fear and it's real worry.
Rabbi Louis Sachs speaking to his congregation in Toronto. We'll talk about what it means to be Jewish in this country. Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and you're listening to The Current. Molotov cocktails thrown on a synagogue in Germany. Stars of David sprayed on residential buildings in France. A Jewish cemetery desecrated in Austria. Jewish synagogues and stores attacked in Spain. And in Sydney, Australia, a demonstration against Israel that included chants of "Gas the Jews." The Anti-Defamation League reports that in the United States, anti-Jewish incidents are up nearly 400% since the war between Israel and Hamas began a month ago. Here, according to Statistics Canada, Jewish Canadians are the most targeted religious group for hate crimes, despite making up only 1% of the population. Joining me now to discuss this rise in anti-Semitism are three guests. Rabbi Louis Sachs of the Beth Torah congregation in Toronto, Karen Mock, a human rights consultant and former executive director of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada and of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and David Bezmoskas, a Jewish writer and filmmaker. His latest book is Immigrant City. Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Karen, this has been a tough month. How are you doing?
It's been a very tough month, and I guess you could say I'm hanging on by a thread. The phone hasn't stopped ringing. I have family over there, as they say. Cousins have been called up. And here in Canada, the situation is getting worse and worse.
When you say worse and worse, just briefly describe what that means to you.
Well, the kinds of calls I've been getting are from schools and school boards and individuals where people are afraid, really afraid. The fear is palpable. People don't want to put their Magen Davids, their Star of Davids out. They tuck them in or wear a kippah in the streets of Canada and in their workplaces. People shunning them, making sarcastic remarks. There's always a yes, but when they know the kind of pain that their Jewish colleagues are in. And there doesn't seem to be an easy answer. People are falling all over themselves, even though for many, many years we have been saying in the kinds of training that people are having in the so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion, they've been leaving anti-Semitism off their curriculum. And so now, although there have been many of us trying to be as inclusive as possible and help people ensure that they validate everybody's identity and put their own theories and policies into practice, the you-know-what has simply hit the fan. And Jews, many Jews, I would venture to say most Jews in Canada are beginning to feel unsafe.
Rabbi Sachs, what are you hearing from your congregants about what they're living through right now?
Very much the same thing. It's a mix of difficulty with our close connection, both to people and religiously to the land of Israel and everything happening there right now, and as well as here locally, feeling like some of our allies, our friends, our colleagues, people that we imagine would be there to stand with us aren't. I'm hearing from lots of people about the fear of going out identifiably Jewish in public, and particularly on university campuses, from some of our younger congregants, our young adult congregants, about their experiences. They are really just being treated very differently if they have anything identifiably Jewish, because they're instantly linked then, not as a Jew, but with a government on the other side of the world.
What do you tell them? I mean, as somebody who's in a position of leadership, people would come to you looking for guidance. What do you say to them?
It's a difficult question because it's a very personal choice. While I walk around publicly with a kippah and identifiably Jewish, I very much recognize that everyone has a different level of comfort and safety, and at the end of the day has to make that choice for themselves of where they feel comfortable accepting risk.
Do you feel safe?
I generally do, but I do feel differently if I'm walking around at night and with my dog and people I'm passing, and it's definitely changed the way I feel in the streets of Toronto, which which is not a great feeling.
David Bezmoskas, you wrote about this in the Globe and Mail in a really powerful piece. And one of the things that you said is, these are your words, in the weeks since Hamas massacred some 1,400 Israelis and abducted more than 200 into Gaza, Jews around the world, including in Canada and the United States, have come to the shocking realization that a significant number of their fellow citizens are indifferent to their pain, openly celebrate it, or under the right conditions would inflict more. Tell me about how you're doing, having written something like that.
Well, my qualifications to be on this call, I think, are not like Karen's or the rabbis. I'm just talking about my own family, people I know. I mean, also things that I'm reading. But yeah, there's, as never before, I think, for American and Canadian Jews, a sense of there's fear, that there's anger, dismay. And yeah, it's something that I think people who have never experienced it before are really shocked at. I mean, part of my piece is also like I come from the Soviet Union, and my parents grew up in a state in a country where being a Jew, there was anti-Semitism was just something you were aware of. I mean, there was state-sanctioned anti-Semitism. And I also, grew up in a place, was born in a place where, as I wrote in my piece, in the woods behind the apartment building where I lived, there were mass graves of Jews, all over Eastern Europe. It's just a fact. I mean, Jews were just killed there. And you go in Riga, it's pretty much everywhere. So it's just a different sense of how close the consequences of this type of hatred can be.
But you live in a very different place now, which is also part of that piece. And so living here in Canada, having grown up, as you say, in Europe, how do you process what's unfolding now?
I mean, that is, the two reasons, the two things that I wanted to write about is one, the return of this fear, and the other is, well, we're also in Canada. I mean, this is a country that has taken in people who are fleeing all sorts of persecution and hatred, not just Jews, but all sorts of people who have come here. And I write, including people who have, fled Israel because of persecution there. But there is a difference about being here in that we're free to express ourselves, and we're supposed to live here peacefully, democratically. And when I talk about expressing ourselves, it's also being able to say things that you wouldn't be allowed to say in other countries. Like, for instance, if there are people who are Palestinian or Muslim who in any way demonstrate sympathy to what happened in Israel, I think there are many places in the world where they couldn't say it. But in Canada, they can. And the same thing within the Jewish community. I think there's a plurality of opinion and feeling. I think, the idea is you can feel the pain of the other. I think that really is the problem right now, where people, should be humbled, deeply humbled about what's happening and the amount of suffering that's happened. But there's not a lot of humility out there, or it doesn't appear to be. And the people who I think are capable or want to feel the pain of the other, we're just not seeing them. And I think it would be nice to see in our streets evidence of that instead of rival marches, Canadians coming together and saying, we believe in peaceful coexistence.
Rabbi Sachs, how do you navigate the divisions within, such as they might be within the community? The community isn't a monolith. And so to David's point, you may have people who believe, whether it's on the left or the right, or believe a range of different things when it comes to this war as it unfolds. How do you navigate those divisions in the community?
Well, it's true that Jewish people are by no means monolithic. In light of the pain inflicted in the terrorist attack on October 7th, I found that the community is really united together. While there are some on the far left or the far right that are standing out, they don't represent the mainstream voice of the community. And I've seen the community really stand with each other in a way that I haven't in my lifetime, that I'm told, hasn't happened since the Yom Kippur War, when Jews around the world felt very much similarly under attack and threatened in this way after everything happening in Israel at the time. But in particular, on the far left, there's groups that give room for anti-Semitism by standing out and saying things, allowing others to say, oh, look, I saw a Jewish person say this, so it's not offensive. Or I saw a Jewish person say this, so it's okay for me to say. And the truth is it's not. Right? They don't represent the community. And just because one person said it or a small group, minority says something, it doesn't make it okay for others to say it. And the idea that Zionism, which is a deeply rooted religious expression. It's in our texts. It's for 2,000 years since we were sent out from Israel. We've been praying for a return, right? Not to say there hasn't been a Jewish presence in Israel throughout that whole time, but it's a central religious idea. So to compare that to settler colonialism or to saying that we're outsiders, that we're from other parts of Europe, that we should go back, that there shouldn't be an Israel at all. And there are far left Jewish voices that say things like that. And there are also some on the extreme ultra Haredi, not that I think even most of the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community would say that they represent them. Either these groups that we see protesting against the Jewish state, against Israel, and seem to condone almost, right? The whole sentiment that what happened on October 7th was somehow justified resistance rather than just a gruesome attack on civilians that anyone with any decency should be able to condemn. But the fact that there are some Jews that take that approach, it, I think, gives space for others to say that it was deserved, which is just a despicable and deplorable thing for anyone to say.
Karen Mock, how have you seen this play out in the work that you do?
I've seen it play out in the yes, but that you hear. When it was just mentioned, use of language like colonial settlers and so on, the co-option even of language to apply to this situation, throwing around terms like genocide and people quoting chapter and verse from theories, but having no idea that those same theories simply do not apply. Some of the most offensive to me have been when people have said, well, it isn't anti-Semitism when they make these chants and have these protests. It's political protest. I said, no, it's not a political protest when Jewish businesses are boycotted or people are harassed. If they want to make a political protest, they go and demonstrate outside a consulate. They would call it anti-Asian racism. Some of my colleagues, of course, in this work, when people are saying don't go to Chinatown or boycott Chinese restaurants because of the government of China and their actions, but they refuse to call it anti-Semitism and think that this is somehow the dirty A word that is just being used to silence Palestinian voices when it simply couldn't be further from the truth.
David, what do you say to those allegations that supporters of Israel, this is something that you'll hear now, supporters of Israel are trying to stifle legitimate criticism of the actions of the Israeli government by calling those criticisms anti-Semitic. What do you make of that?
I mean, I just go back to the sense that that nobody's really trying to feel the pain of the other person or taking it seriously and legitimately. As a writer, as a novelist, so much of what I do is try to think about and empathize with how people feel. But I don't think that's happening. I think when Jews say that they're in pain, I don't think people take it seriously. I think when Jews reference the idea that this is a pogrom, people don't even know what that means. I don't think they know historically the horror of, basically ethnic mass murder and rape, which is what happened. And yeah, it's shocking that if it's coming from the progressive left, the idea that women being raped, the idea that Hamas, which is, not a democratic entity, like all these things that should be antithetical to people who consider themselves progressive and believe in social justice, whether you like Israel or not. If you are deaf to this sort of horror and pain, I think it's at that point that you should ask yourself why.
In the piece that you wrote for the Globe, you said that, people have talked about, in the Jewish community, some people have talked about feeling, and the rabbi hinted at this, feeling abandoned by some folks, perhaps on the far left. And you said that in the piece you weren't shocked by some of those comments. Why?
I don't know, because I've seen instances in my life where I wasn't shocked. I can give you a very short anecdote. In 2004, if people remember, there was the attacks in Darfur, and me and other writers, we created an event. It was called Darfur After Dark, and it was an event all across Canada, and we put together, I actually wrote up a play based on the United Nations Security Council meeting at the time, where all the various representatives, Germany, China, there were actors, not actors, but writers. Michael Ondaatje played one. I mean, it was that sort of thing. The only one I didn't change was what the Sudanese ambassador to the UN said. And after people listening to all these horrible things, they gathered to condemn Sudan, I left his remarks in, and his remarks were that he started talking about, well, what about Israel and this about Israel? And in a room of people who had gathered to condemn this and who felt terribly about the rape and the killing that was happening in South Sudan, people cheered. People cheered the words of the Sudanese ambassador to the United Nations because he talked about Israeli repression.
What did that tell you?
It's messed up. It's messed up. I think that that whatever it is, whether it's some type of ideological indoctrination on the left or whatever it is, I mean, it's, the other thing I wrote, like anti-Semitism morphs. It can be the Nazis were anti-Semitic for one reason, the Soviets were anti-Semitic for another reason. You can always find a reason to hate Jews. And it seemed that way to me, that for whatever reason, being able to have double standards when it comes to Jews and Israel is just acceptable on the left.
Karen, when David talks about that idea of empathy, of feeling somebody else's pain, this is work that you've done, right, in terms of outreach to the Palestinian community. What are you doing now when it comes to that outreach?
You could call some of us the surviving remnant of people who are reaching out to each other. That's been the biggest disappointment, is that many of the people with whom we have worked for years in Muslim-Jewish dialogue, in Arab-Jewish dialogue, empathizing, teaching each other, and working together to even go into schools and universities to help people see how you need to empathize with the other. We need to stop any humanitarian disasters. We need to stop hate and violence. And when the murders happened in Quebec and our rabbi launched this Rings of Peace around mosques to show that we would be there, that we would have their back, that we would protect them, this is something that we haven't seen this time round. And we again have the yes, but. We have school boards, for example. We have organizations that have been doing this kind of dialogue and diversity, equity, and inclusion work for years. And just this week, a school board where they even had sessions on anti-Semitism and how we are truly inclusive in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, a school board put out a notice to give resources on how to counter slurs and discrimination against all groups. It seems to me that in that school board and many others, where the rise of anti-Semitic incidents and hate has been quadrupled, there was the sin of omission again, and anti-Semitism wasn't even mentioned in the list. So that really resonates. That says, what is going on? This resurrection of hateful anti-Semitism under the guise of wanting to have empathy.
Are you encouraged? Are you encouraged by in Ontario and British Columbia? There are moves to bring or establish education around the Holocaust into schools, into school curriculums. Are you encouraged by that? Is that something that's needed to contain, if I can put it that way, anti-Semitism in this country?
On the one hand, I'm encouraged by that. On the other hand, I'm concerned that they are calling the curriculum Holocaust education and anti-Semitism, as if that is where anti-Semitism belongs. There are lots of resources for Holocaust education, and it's very important that history is taught. Years ago, they eliminated history from the compulsory curriculum in the later years in high school, and we're feeling the pain of that. But anti-Semitism is something that needs to be part of social justice education. We have a group called Enhancing Social Justice Education, because in many teacher education facilities, they've removed anti-Semitism from the social justice and anti-racist and anti-oppression agenda. or curriculum. So you're absolutely right that it's very important that people know history. They certainly are bound to repeat it, as Santiana told us, if they don't know history. But I was quite taken with the city of Toronto's campaign last year. Sadly, not enough people saw it. And the city of Toronto, under their Toronto for All, because they'd had campaigns for every other group, but had not had one against anti-Semitism, their theme was that anti-Semitism only seems like old news. And there are lots of resources that the city has provided if you go to their website on the Toronto for All, but people are not using those, and they're not understanding that they need to include anti-Semitism on the anti-racist, anti-oppression agenda.
Rabbi Sachs, we're just about out of time. Let me ask you just briefly, and this goes back to the work that you do as a leader. What is the message that you would give to Jewish and non-Jewish Canadians about the moment that we're in right now?
I think what David was talking about a moment ago about empathy is incredibly important. I stood in front of my congregation during the high holidays and I gave a sermon specifically about how we need to have empathy for the other side. We need to have empathy for Palestinians, that there are many Palestinian civilians that are just as much a victim of Hamas as Israel is. And it's all the more true, I think, today. At the same time, it's very difficult to express that empathy and to be vulnerable in that way when we're not feeling it back, when we're not feeling any of that outreach from the other side, right? As Karen mentioned about when the mosque was attacked and the Jewish people going out to circle around it. When another mosque in Ontario was attacked, I reached out to a imam that I sat on an interfaith council with. And when the synagogue was attacked in Pittsburgh, I heard nothing back. I heard nothing from any of my colleagues, and I've been involved in a lot of interfaith work. And similarly now. So it's very difficult when all the different groups that Jews have stood with, whether it's LGBTQ rights, whether it's rights for people with disabilities, whether it's standing up with Black Lives Matter, nobody then feels like is standing with us. And that's where it's gotten very difficult.
David, is that possible, David? I mean, you say in the piece, where is that march or the campaign that recognizes the pain of the other? And that's specifically what the rabbi is calling for. Is that possible in this moment?
Of course. Why not? We can do anything we want to do. If we generally feel empathy, if we see the news from Gaza and see children and, civilians being killed and it horrifies us, I feel it. Why can't somebody who is Palestinian also feel seeing the videos of, women being taken aside and taken into Gaza and spit upon, and you can see that they've been badly abused and, that people have been killed. I mean, you can feel two things at once. We're sophisticated creatures, humans. We can do it. And we live in Canada in a place where it's possible. We're able to do it without getting into trouble with our governments for doing it. And in fact, I think it would make people feel a lot better if they saw something like that rather than a rival march here, Israeli flags in one part of the city, Palestinian flags in another part of the city. I don't see why we can't do it. I mean, I understand emotions are high and it's, but we can do anything we want to do because we're in a country where that's possible.
I'm glad to speak with you all about this. It is a difficult moment for so many people around the world. Thank you for taking time to speak with us.
Thank you for inviting us.
Rabbi Sachs is the rabbi of the Beth Torah congregation in Toronto. Karen Mock is a human rights consultant, former executive director of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada and of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And David Bezmoskas is a writer and filmmaker, creative director of the Humber School for Writers, and he wrote a piece about this very issue in the Globe and Mail just in the last couple of days.